In Galatians 2, verse 6 to 8, we're going to see that there is a gospel that was preached to the Jews as well as to the Gentiles, and that this is exactly the same gospel, yet to two different people groups. And Paul comes and he's making the point here that he had a gospel, that he had a message, and that he actually came and taught something to the people in Jerusalem, which they didn't know. Now let us read Galatians 2, verse 6 to 8. But of those who seem to be somewhat, whatsoever they were, it makes no matter to me. God accepts no man's person, for they who seem to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. But contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter, for he that wrought effectually in Peter to apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me towards the Gentiles. So what Paul comes and what he's explaining here is that, and the whole backbone of his argument here is, he was not sent by the people in Jerusalem to come and preach a message which they already understood and told him and taught him to preach. He wants them to understand that the gospel that he got from God. And again, I know I repeat myself, it is for this reason that should the people in Jerusalem now start to preach a different gospel, that he will not be drawn in with that. That they would know, well, it might be the same gospel, but the one got it from Jesus when he walked on the earth, and Paul got it from Jesus directly when Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus, and after that, as God would reveal things to him. So here he comes and he says that as he went into conference, as he was speaking to the, like he says here, to those who seemed to be something amongst them, he says, well, to him it didn't matter. He says the church they were really keeping, and I guess here Peter and James and some of the apostles really in high esteem, he says here, to him it meant nothing. It meant that Paul was saying it wasn't a special thing for him, and he wasn't now going to submit to Peter's doctrine or James' doctrine or whatever just because they walked with Jesus or because they've got a big church in Jerusalem or any of those things. That means nothing to him. That's what he is saying. Can you see how adamant he is to stick to the truth? How he is not influenced by the things of this world. He says, for they who seem to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. So what he's saying is that those people didn't add anything to him when they were in conference. When you go and read Acts 15, you will see that their whole argument and everything they said, they didn't add anything to him. And we find that in Acts 15, it seems to me as if it was the first time that the church in Jerusalem was really facing this whole thing about circumcision for the Gentiles. Not even talking about circumcision for the Jews. That was a completely another point. The whole thing was to the church in Jerusalem, should the Gentiles be circumcised? Yes or no? If they believe on Jesus as the Messiah. Can the Gentiles be saved as they believe upon the Messiah without being circumcised? That was the question there. And then they came and they had a big debate, and James had to come forth, Peter had to come forth talking about how the Gentiles received the Holy Spirit and so forth, also with the whole thing in the back of his mind of don't call anybody accursed, talking about that sheet that came from heaven with the unclean animals and so forth. And for the first time there was a real argument or a real debate, and they had to put forth their statements, which was that the Gentiles don't have to be circumcised. We're not even talking about should the Jews be circumcised. I think that was such a taboo, not even to be discussed in the church back then. And that we can actually pick up from Acts 21, but we're not going to go in there. So it says here, but of those who seem to be somewhat I mean, I don't care who they were. I didn't regard them, their person at all, because God doesn't do that. They added nothing to me. And now he goes in verse 7, he says, but contrariwise. In other words, they added nothing to me, but contrariwise. The word contrariwise there actually means that he added something to them. And what did he add to them? He says, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter, we can read it, as of the circumcision unto Peter. It says in verse 8 then, for he who wrought effectively in Peter to apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me towards the Gentiles. Now, what Paul was saying here was that these people were not really familiar with the gospel unto the Gentiles. They knew that we cannot call the Gentiles accursed, and the Gentiles did receive. And there was an instance when this took place and where the Gentiles received the gospel when Peter preached to them, and this was recorded in Acts. But they didn't have a big thing towards that. Their whole vision was the Jews. Now it's funny to me, and I thought about it many times, why would Paul not go and preach to Gentiles? Because God showed to him, Peter. Why didn't Peter go and preach to the Gentiles? Because when he saw that sheet coming out of heaven, and that God told him, call nothing unclean, which I have called clean, and then he preached, and the Holy Spirit came upon the Gentiles, and then he says, what stops us to have these people baptized, because they received the Spirit as we have? It was as if Peter just chucked that out of his mind. And now the first time it really comes forth again is in Acts 15, where there was now a big dispute about this, where by this time, I believe, there shouldn't have been any dispute about that. Should Peter have taken what God has shown him and just preached that and made that known to everybody in the church? I find that Peter was scared. That's my conclusion there. Peter was scared. He didn't want this confrontation. He didn't want that. And he just felt that the gospel was given unto Peter, the good news for the Jews. The good news for the Jews that their Messiah has come, that their Messiah is, Jesus is King and Lord. And that's what he preached to them. But the focus and the understanding was not broadened unto how this will work amongst the Gentiles. And here we clearly see that Paul comes in with a message wherein he had a revelation of God, that it is about all the nations that shall be blessed. And I'm sure with many words, many scriptures, he was explaining his point in Acts 15, and then he actually, like he says, you're contrariwise. In other words, he added something to them. He actually taught them about the gospel to the Gentiles and how he was doing it. Now God was working miracles amongst the Gentiles, and he came up with a much more refined message about the gospel to the Gentiles. And they basically said that that God that worked effectively unto the apostleship, or to be sent for Peter to be sent to the circumcised, the same was now towards Paul. And that they acknowledged, listen, Paul is an apostle. Paul is a sent one. They didn't, and I believe Paul comes here and he makes a point here, and that he is saying that the apostleship to the circumcision was wrought of God in Peter. No, not man ordained, man apostleship. Apostle means to be sent one, not sent of man. It was God working in Peter. And now the same for the Gentiles. It was God that worked in Paul. Paul not being sent from the church in Jerusalem, but he actually went and taught them a thing or two as pertaining to the gospel to the Gentiles. And in our next verses, verse 9 to 10, we're going to see what their reaction was when they could see that this apostleship was really given by God to Paul. Well, that was Galatians 2, verse 6 to 8.